Professor Bacevich, let's begin there. Talk about the U.S.-Putin connection and why you feel the U.S. is partially responsible for what's taking place.
Well, I think I would describe it as a U.S.-Russia connection because it's not necessarily limited to Mr. Putin. And the key issue here, I think, is when the Cold War ended. And when the Cold War ended, of course, Russia was in a position of great weakness and vulnerability. And the United States and its allies chose to exploit that weakness. The most vivid expression of that was the eastward expansion of NATO. Let's remind ourselves, NATO was an anti-Soviet alliance when it was created in 1949. Expansion of NATO basically moved it up to the borders of post-Soviet Russia. At that time, there were many Americans. George Kennan, the diplomat, would be perhaps the most prominent, that warned against NATO expansion as likely to cause us troubles down the road. We ignored those warnings, and I think that we're kind of in a chickens coming home to roost situation right here. Putin has, I am not a Putin apologist, and he's the principal cause of this catastrophe that we're experiencing. But Putin had been quite candid in warning that the eastward movement of NATO, and in particular the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, constituted, from his perspective, a vital threat, a threat to vital Russian security interests. We ignored that, and I think to some degree this terrible, unnecessary war is the result of that.
Well, you know, you're not the only one who says this. One person who warned years ago about NATO expansion in Eastern Europe is William Burns, the current director of the CIA. He served as U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2005 to 2008. And in his memoir, The Back Channel, Burns wrote, quote, "Sitting at the embassy in Moscow in the mid-90s, it seemed to me that NATO expansion was premature at best and needlessly provocative at worst." And then in 1995, Burns wrote a memo saying, quote, "Hostility to early NATO expansion is almost universally felt across the domestic political spectrum here." He's talking about Russia. In another memo, Burns wrote, "Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle-draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests." Again, those the words of the current director of the Central Intelligence Agency, William Burns. Andrew Bacevich.
Oh, so one would say that given that kind of warning from a very senior official, highly respected senior official, why did we go ahead and do it anyway? And I think there are two answers to that question. One is because Europeans so desperately wanted to join NATO and to join the EU, seizing their chance to have democracy, to have liberalism, to have the possibility of prosperity. You know, my paternal grandparents came from Lithuania. Lithuania was in the vanguard of countries that wanted to join the EU and NATO. I don't blame the Lithuanian people for that aspiration. And in many respects, joining NATO and the EU has paid dividends for Lithuania. That said, it was done in the face of objections by the Russians, and now we're paying the consequences of those objections. And I think the other reason we did it, of course, apart from what I think is really kind of a deep-seated Russophobia that pervades many members of the American elite, was the belief at that time, that is to say back in the 1990s, the belief that Russia couldn't do anything about it. Russia was weak, Russia was disorganized, and therefore it seemed to be a low risk proposition to exploit Russian weakness to advance our objectives and also to advance the objectives of other European countries, most of which had either been part of the Soviet Union or had been Soviet satellites and saw the end of the Cold War as their chance to achieve freedom and prosperity. I don't blame the Lithuanians. I don't blame the Poles. But I do think that American decision makers acted impetuously and indeed recklessly, and now we're facing the consequences.